What is Matt Pines, what is your opinion as far as do these represent vehicles of non-human intelligence? I mean, of course, we know stuff, we saw the whole China balloon thing, but with the evidence that you've seen, where do you stand on this? What's your feeling?
Yes, I think it's very likely that these represent technologies of non-human origin.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say so. So you were talking earlier about some of kind of the more explosive allegations regarding UAP. And of course, we have the allegations from David Grush about a crash retrieval and back engineering program. What kind of probability would you assign to that as being true?
Again, we're sort of in this, we're in a clearing and we have to look out into this dark forest and try to assess probabilities of different propositions with circumstantial evidence, and until we actually get hard, tangible physical evidence into the public domain for like independent evaluation, you always have to sort of discount your belief systems. So I sort of have tried to be a Bayesian with regard to this question in terms of, okay, where can I ground my feet in something that's I view as very high credence, and then given that, how do then I evaluate these potentially more speculative, more quite provocative propositions? But they're interrelated, right? So if you believe the premise that the U.S. government is in possession of technologies of unknown origin, exotic origin, historical exotic technology antecedents, the terminology that's been used by Congress, then it's like not that much of a Bayesian jump to say, well, we've been trying to figure out how they work.
Sure.
And then it's not that much of a Bayesian jump to figure out, maybe we figured out some principles of physics or materials design that have inspired other platforms. And so these are just like you just treat it analytically without any, kind of cruft of social taboo or kind of our cultural frames. And these are sort of, you have to sort of discount each step of that proposition. But I think it's now plausible to me that we do have programs to retrieve and try to, reverse engineer. Even Sean Kirkpatrick's own mission overview statement basically said that's part of what Arrow's job was going to be, if he actually did his job, was to actually set up these different sort of functional divisions inside Arrow to do crash retrieval and exploitation, and to do fundamental research and development with frontier physicists, including outside scientists and theoretical physicists. And so I look at that and I say, well, the government basically said they had a crash. They were trying to, in the open domain, right, with Arrow, create what on the face of it would be a crash retrieval, reverse engineering, exploitation, and fundamental science project focused on UAPs, right? Obviously, there's probably other activities that fit the description as well. But you just look at the Arrow mission overview briefing, and it's like that's what they said was the plan for Arrow, right? So I don't know. That's not like you ask that question. It's like it's kind of they said it right there. And then of course I look at at the end of the day, unless you have firsthand knowledge of those programs, which to be clear, I do not. I've not personally been involved in any related UAP programs. I look at some folks that have serious professional bona fides, long distinguished careers, are highly respected individuals in our society. In particular, one that I have had the good fortune to speak with is a gentleman named Harold Malmgren, who has had probably one of the most distinguished careers in U.S. government in the last century, right? This guy was like a wonderkind, recruited into the Defense Department as one of McNamara's kind of whiz kids, and was at the front lines of the Cuban Missile Crisis in his 20s.
Wow.
And was advising national decision makers on nuclear strategy, in his 20s. Was sent down. Now he's made public remarks on this fact that he was sent out to Los Alamos to basically help do the design cost build for our first generation of anti-ballistic missile systems, which at that time had to be sort of nuclear tipped,
right?
to work. So he had to basically get access to, what was then our most sensitive security programs inside the Defense Department, as well as the Department of Energy. And he's described publicly how when he was out there, he met with Lawrence Geis, who was then the director of the Western Division of the Atomic Energy Commission, where he had responsibility over the entire, archipelago of research facilities, engineering facilities, Los Alamos, Sandia, et cetera. And Lawrence Geis told him of their, attempts to, and retrievals of UAP UFO materials. And then he had a similar encounter where he had a private briefing with Richard Bissell, who is sort of known as like the kind of the shadow super spook inside the CIA. Right? He was the guy that got stuff done for the Dulles brothers, and he was essentially the director of operations. And he also was responsible for setting up he was responsible for creating and setting up Area 51. He was, top of the pile when it comes to our most sort of spooky activities from the 50s through the 60s. He, ran that whole era. And he, Harold Malmgren describes a private briefing he had where Richard Bissell told him of their efforts to retrieve and reverse engineer what he called otherworld technologies. And Harold Malmgren has now come out and said explicitly that the U.S. federal government and certain private sector institutions are in possession of non-human technology. Harold Malmgren, you just look at his resume. This guy has, he's kind of like the shadow Kissinger, what I would say. Like everyone, right. Kissinger was a self-promoter, right? The guy was trying to establish himself as kind of this generational, key leader in U.S. national security and sort of global geopolitical influence. Harold Malmgren probably had equivalent levels of influence to Kissinger throughout that entire period, multiple presidents, but was known as kind of like the guy that just got stuff done, that was not trying to actually get power, but Harold Malmgren had like senior contacts in most governments around the world, including the Russians and the Chinese and the Japanese, for many decades. And he was known as kind of like the back channel for many presidents on our most sensitive, geopolitical and economic questions. And he's still, he's coming out and saying things. And I was like, pay close attention to what folks like Harold Malmgren say, and like know what he has seen and done over his, 88 years on this planet. And it would, I don't know. You have to explain that one away to me. So that's just one anecdote of one particular individual. But I've had similar conversations with folks like that, and you just have to be like, this is just true. You just got to bite that bullet, and then integrate it into your larger mental models and try to figure out how to interpret it.
I think it was about like 2 years ago, you had the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, I think he was on Good Morning America, and they asked him about UAP. And he said, if I remember right, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he essentially said, yeah, it's real, but it's not a national security threat, so we're not going to worry about it. It's kind of in a nutshell what he was saying and what some of these other national security officials were saying. Especially, you hear that same kind of reasoning out of the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. But if these are not a national security issue / threat, then what better demonstrates this than the recent cases in which the Pentagon has had these drones interfering with their in their restricted airspace. So you had I say drones, they're calling them unmanned aerial systems over Langley.
And drone activity over U.S. military airspace is fueling questions on what's being done to monitor such aircraft. U.S. Air Force officials confirming several unmanned drones flew over Langley Air Force Base in Virginia back in December. It's been brought up at congressional hearings twice just this month alone. In one exchange, Senator Mark Kelly questioned the Joint Chiefs Chairman on why and how these drones got so close to sensitive military airspace. Take a listen.
One of the things we have to continue to work on is to continue to understand the technology that's moving forward and then move at the same pace as it was highlighted. We do have to move faster. And so it's an area that we collectively have to continue to work on, not only here in defense here in the United States, but also at our forward locations where we have many of our service members deployed.
And this issue is the topic of the latest episode of one of our new podcasts. And right now, the link to Reality Check with Ross Coulthart is live. Just take out your phone, scan this QR code right here at the bottom of your screen, or visit News Nation's website or our YouTube page to get that link. But joining me now is Reality Check host and News Nation special correspondent Ross Coulthart. Ross, good to have you this morning. In your latest episode, you interview a witness to the mysterious drones that flew over Langley Air Force Base. Let's take a listen to what he had to say first.
Kind of confirmed to me that it was Langley when I would sometimes see a searchlight that would start flashing from the ground and kind of wave back and forth, never really focusing on any of them as they went past, but just kind of like just waving back and forth. The orbs, I would say, looked about car-sized. I mean, just from that distance. And they kept a very steady pace until they got over that location, in which they would start hovering over the base.
Yeah, so Ross, the government says they don't know the origin of these drones, but you see that video we played there to the right-hand side of the screen. What's your take on who could be sending drones over U.S. airspace?
Well, firstly, good morning, Marky. The word they're using is drones, but there's no evidence that these are what we would call commercial or military drones. The witness that I interviewed, Jonathan Butner, he was close enough to see for sure whether there were propeller blades or any kind of propulsion system that was keeping these drones hovering in the air. And as he says, this was car-sized. These were large, orange orb objects with no visible means of propulsion. And this isn't just happening at Langley Air Force Base. These incidents are happening all across key military installations and particularly nuclear facilities all across the United States. And I know the Air Force likes to use the euphemism of drones because that offers a palatable possible alternative, that it might be a foreign adversary. But there has been no evidence presented of any foreign adversary being able to deploy drones in what at Langley Air Force Base is one of the most sensitive Air Force bases on the East Coast. This is where we've got F-22 Raptors. This is the forward defense for for Washington, D.C. This is a very, very important military base, and it's quite clear it's not possible to stop these objects from coming into that very, very sensitive military airspace.
Yeah, I know people have floated the idea of this being, sent from China or Russia especially after we saw that Chinese spy balloon just last year. This latest episode also talks about how the Mexican drug cartels are using drones over our southern border. I mean, are drones changing the way American enemies are spying on us?
They are. Indeed, they are. I think the estimation from Northcom's commander has been that there's 1,000 drone incursions alone across the southern border of the United States, particularly from crime cartels in Mexico. And the alarming thing is that there are admissions that these drones are technologies far beyond what the United States is capable of producing itself. They're using highly advanced technology, obviously to bring in illicit materials, perhaps weapons, perhaps drugs, and this is largely unregulated and unmonitored. It's a huge concern, and we interview Congressman Glenn Grothman in the story, who talks about this as a major issue of concern. What he also raises is concerns, frankly, that we need to ensure that there's greater reporting of anomalous objects that are seen in our skies, so that these things are brought to the attention of authorities, because we have a crazy situation where reporting these objects is so stigmatized that pilots don't feel comfortable about coming forward. And there's a laudatory piece of legislation that the congressman is pushing with his colleagues in the House, which will essentially allow pilots to get protections, to know that they can come forward to the FAA and other agencies and know that they're not going to suffer harassment or intimidation in their job for coming forward and telling the truth about what they're seeing.
And I think there was one out here over Skunk Works, and of course we know these things have been interfering with naval air operations during carrier workups off of the East Coast and West Coast. So my question is, do you think that the Pentagon is avoiding classifying these airborne vehicles as UAP and instead classifying them as UAS? Do you think that they're being purposeful in avoiding labeling these as UAP? Because a lot of what we're hearing from folks is that these things are not really behaving like traditional drones in terms of what we know about them.
Yeah, I think there's multiple things going on, right? One is the typical, any government senior bureaucrat it's a very political position. The first thing you know is just like, you don't want to take blame for anything. You always want to downplay any problem that's potentially within your sphere of influence or responsibility, so that you're just not asked to do anything about it, right? It's just
right.
I don't want to have to deal with this, so I'm just going to pretend it's not a problem, and unless someone in Congress or someone above me forces me to, my life is just easier that way. right? And so like the path of least resistance for senior bureaucrats, even senior military leaders, is often just to like, unless it's a problem that somebody is forcing me to address, it's easier for me just to pretend it's not a real problem. And you ideally have mechanisms of accountability or right leadership that like appreciates the severity and seriousness of the various sort of, you know, national security challenges that fall within the domain, and they actually own up to those. So that's not maybe a unique problem in UAPs. It's just an issue with any, you know, large bureaucracy. Principal agent problems of folks in charge is not necessarily to like, you know, publicly recognize the, you know, maybe things that would point at their failures, right? It's just nobody likes that, right? And so like the naming is maybe you know, some tactic to do that, right? If we can just avoid naming it, you know, a certain way, then that, you know, allows us to sweep this under the rug. I think it's a much broader issue though, that then becomes more complicated in light of the fact that there are parts of the government that definitely do treat it very seriously, right? And because of that fact, don't want to draw attention to the fact that we take it very seriously, right? Both maybe for public consumption reasons, they don't want to have, you know, awkward questions asked to their leadership, as well as maybe for prudent counterintelligence reasons, right? We don't want to give away the fact that we have gaps in our air domain awareness. We don't want to have our adversaries understand that they can just, you know, freely penetrate these sensitive facilities until we have a mitigation in place, you know. So I kind of understand the folks responsible for these bases or the air defense or these different systems. They're given certain tools and different authorities, and their job is to, you know, do the immediate response or write the report. And then it's a political decision ultimately within those different bureaucracies as to how that's going to translate into change of policy or public messaging. And I think the UAP UAS question is one of these where those overlap in a way that just reinforces the problem, in the sense that there are likely serious counterintelligence incursions and issues where adversaries are trying to test our air domain awareness over different facilities. They are trying to, you know, fly balloons and sophisticated surveillance platforms over these facilities. And we have a strong national security interest in not giving away what extent we are or are not aware of those activities, right? Obviously, there's a big flap about not being able to track these balloons. We'll see if that was true or not, right?
Right.
But so I think there's a bureaucratic incentive to kind of conflate these things, and it's up to folks in Congress to sort of not let that conflation happen. And I think that's really, to me, the whole question kind of boils down to this, right? Because I do recognize that there are serious national security equities here. We do not want to give away, you know, or expose vulnerabilities in our air domain awareness or our current technical platforms or weapon systems. We also don't want to give away any material strategic advantages we have,
right? And
even potentially as a result of having had possession of these exotic technologies. Like, those are legitimate national security capabilities and platforms, at least in our present system of government. You know, it's government information. Those are government, you know, platforms. They've invested our tax dollars. You know, maybe there's questions of congressional oversight, right, that need to be addressed. But like, in principle, right, as long as the Gang of Eight is aware of those special access programs and they authorize them according to their charter, and they're funding them according to, you know, principles of legitimate, you know, fiduciary responsibility of taxpayer dollars, and they're reporting to our constitutional representatives, like, those capabilities should be secret, right? But I think there's the distinction between the legitimate practice of secrecy inside the government to protect national security and, you know, obscuring these other facts, which are not government information. And it's like the job of Congress to sort of try to delicately sort of slice those apart and say, you can't, in bad faith, you know, shroud the whole thing in claims of secrecy and illegitimately apply, you know, certain secrecy authorities to the whole set of relevant information that you don't necessarily have a legal or a moral right to classify.
Folks have military backgrounds.
Why don't they just let it out? Just let the news out.
Well,
just tell people, just show them the photo of the alien selfie with the president, and then let's get it out there and let's handle it.
We've spent many decades backing ourselves into a corner on this conversation. And the government has said publicly what its position is. Now it's in a situation where it's having to unwind that conversation and say, look, folks, we haven't always been completely forthcoming and truthful with you, and that's a hard conversation to have.
What are you talking about? There's aliens. Have the conversation. There's aliens. There's aliens. There's aliens. I don't know what. All right. Well, can we stop them?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's not a question for me. That's a question for
It's kind of a
leaders.
question for you. I think you're the only one who can, because it sounds like your attitude also seems to be like, yeah, they're here. I've seen them. They have capabilities beyond our understanding, and nothing much we can do about it. So, keep watching Paramount Plus. And I don't know what we're supposed to do about this now.
I personally think Americans can handle the truth about this topic. I think it is. I mean, we can joke a lot about it, but the reality is that these things, whatever they are, wherever they're from,
aliens.
this is real.
Yeah.
So,
these are real? All right.
yeah, it's real. Whatever it is.
Okay, well, is there a chance that if the government tells people aliens are real and shows them, we'll unite together in a global effort to defeat them and call it side out?
There was a famous speech by Reagan back in the 80s where he
By
said,
Bill Pullman in Independence Day.
and him. Yeah, that's right. Where they said that if the truth of this came out, it would probably unite the world. But
Yo, we need it now. Let's go, aliens! Aliens, let's go now. This is the time.
The reality is,
This is the time. We got a lot of shit going down now. Aliens, come. Aliens. I'm down for aliens now. Okay.
if we look, uniting Congress is already a big enough challenge. Let's get these folks on the same sheet of music. Let's get the briefings they need, and then let them have a conversation with their constituents.
You're talking about paperwork. I'm talking about aliens.
Okay, but the government survives off of paperwork. It is a bureaucracy, unfortunately. So we have to look. I've always said there's a right way to do things, and then you can do also it right now. But they're not necessarily the same thing. Doing things right and right now may not be, the same thing.
What do you mean? There's aliens, and you want to go through bureaucracy and try to unite Congress before you can fight the aliens? No, fight the aliens. Get the aliens out.
I think.